referendum?
Oh, we won the referendum. And when you think we had, you know, global big business, virtually every government in the world, we even had President Obama turn up in this country. We were told that if we voted Brexit, dreadful things would happen to our house prices, our stock market, our economy. And in the face of all of that, a majority of people still voted Brexit. It was one hell of a victory.
And does it still feel like a victory now to you?
Well, as somebody who really does believe in Brexit, and you know, and there may well have been one or two on the Brexit camp who perhaps hadn't got quite the same passion as I've got for it, including our current Prime Minister. But I'm frustrated at the concessions we're making. I'm annoyed at the weakness we're showing. I don't like to see foreign bureaucrats bullying around the British Prime Minister, but that's what's been happening. But, you know, however disappointed I am with the time it's taken, with the fact we've got a transition period, that it'll be 5 years before we sign any other trade deals or get any sense of a grip on our border, though I suspect it'll be much longer than 5 years before we deal with that. Despite all of those things, the big picture is that 1 year from today, we will leave the Treaty of Rome and all its subsequent treaties, and that is a major historic day in the history of this country. That's the day we become a normal, independent, self-governing nation again. So overall, despite my frustrations, we're going in the right direction, just more slowly than I would like.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to all that in the form of a question later on. But just to go back to the campaign, I mean, you've campaigned in British politics for a long time, but is there anything you learnt about the British electorate during the referendum in particular?
I think it's remarkable. They make their minds up, and once they've made their minds up, they stick. Because I think that the last week of, I felt on the Wednesday and Thursday prior to the referendum, there was no doubt in my mind that the big momentum was with Leave. We had the big M going for us. You could feel it. And just incidents like my little conversation with Sir Bob Geldof on the Thames, things like that, were all kind of playing our way. Thank you, Sir Bob. But I think that the murder that took place on Thursday lunchtime with Joe Cox, there was a feeling that maybe because of that and because of the guy that had committed it, that maybe people would shift, maybe there'd be quite a big swing back towards the Remain side, and there wasn't. People didn't change their minds. It stopped the campaign for 3 or 4 days for obvious and respectful reasons. So what I've learned is once people make their minds up, it's quite tough to shift them.
But you conceded.
Well, at 10 o'clock, after the polls had closed, after, if I'm honest, a longer lunch than I should really have had on that day, I said, hey, I don't know, you know, maybe we will, maybe we won't. I did feel what happened on the morning of polling day was remarkable. You know, an opinion poll that comes out from a supposedly reputable company saying that Remain's 10 points ahead, dramatic shifts in sterling, the stock markets, the betting markets. And I thought to myself, well, I'm used to being in a minority. I'm used to taking on a consensus, but it did seem to be so overwhelming on the day. It was the only time in the last 3 months that I doubted whether we could win was on polling day itself. So maybe it's a bit like, you know, you've got a photo finish coming, and I was preparing myself for the worst. All
right, so just a bit of inside baseball now from a politics nerd that I am. Was Leave.eu more important than Vote Leave?
They were both very important. I mean, I did everything I could. I tried repeatedly to bring everybody together under a really big umbrella. And Leave.eu did that. You know, we had 18 different organisations that were campaigning with us. I was in it, George Galloway was in it, the new Communist Party of Great Britain was in it. I never thought I'd say that. But we brought together everybody, but Vote Leave were not interested. Vote Leave was about the Conservative Party. They had one Labour MP that they put up to sort of pretend they were cross-party. That was about the Conservative Party. I wanted us all to work together. They'd never intended to do that. But as it turned out, I think Boris and Vote Leave were very effective, particularly in some of the sort of middle-class home counties areas or places like Cheshire. So actually, in the end, I think we were complementary.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, with all due respect, surely one of the things that Vote Leave benefited from was plausible deniability about you.
Yeah, well, there is this polling that shows there is this polling that shows that I'm hated. And what's true is by those that are, shall we say, Liberal Democrat, New Labour voters, a lot of them do absolutely hate me because they disagree with everything I talk about. What people don't understand, if I did one big thing in the referendum, it was to mobilise people to go out and vote who perhaps had never voted in their lives. So where people were prepared to listen to me, was that particular group of people. So I probably attract a stronger support base and hate base, but I do think my impact on the middle, and I do believe my impact on getting the turnout up, I think I did my bit.
Okay, so you mentioned Joe Cox. I don't want to talk directly about that, but do you have any regrets about the tone of your campaign during the referendum?
No, I've been subjected to violence and intimidation every day for the previous 4 years. If you take on the establishment in this country, they are vile.
But your campaign, particularly that poster, the Breaking Point poster...
Hang on a second. I didn't encourage violence against anybody. I didn't... there weren't UKIP supporters pelting eggs at Peter Mandelson or anybody else. We've never behaved like that. And yet that's what we had to put up with for year after year after year. Now, the Breaking Point poster, well, of course it's controversial. It's the truth. People don't like the truth very much. The fact is, Mrs. Merkel made an historic error that has changed the future of the European project. And I think part of that vote in this country was about Mrs. Merkel's mistake. And I think the ripples of that you're still seeing right across European politics.
But isn't it at best a skewed truth? Because, first and foremost, we're not in Schengen. It wasn't our issue.
Well, the slogan was the EU has failed us all, which meant it's failed the rest of Europe too. Now, the argument's very simple, that if large numbers of people, huge numbers of people, come into the European Union, unchecked and uncontrolled, within a few short years, they will have European passports. And with a European passport, you can go wherever you like.
But what would you say then to the argument that the referendum led to a significant and quantifiable increase in hate crime?
Just not true, but very cleverly done. I have to commend the BBC particularly. There was an incident... This sums up the mainstream media in this country, or much of it. An incident took place in Harlow in July. The story was that a Polish immigrant had been beaten to death by a group of Brexit-supporting skinhead youths. As the Newsnight report carried a piece that said, Nigel Farage has got blood on his hands. And this was the story. Big increase in hate crime because of Brexit. When that came to trial 9 months later, it turned out the Polish migrant was drunk out of his brains, verbally abused a black kid. One of the black kid's white kids pushed him back. He fell over and banged his head and unfortunately died. And I think you have got so much skewed misreporting of this. If you think about the way the argument was conducted in the campaign, we all said, in the end, even Boris and Michael Gove talked about immigration. There was a wonderful cartoon. It was a bar, and I was at the bar with a pint of Australian-style pints. And it was Boris and Michael saying, we'll have one of what he's having. I mean, we made the argument, we're not against immigration, but it ought to be controlled, it ought to be sensible. And I would reject the fact that we fought an anti-migrant campaign. We didn't.
You don't think that Brexit will ultimately mean that the British become more anti-foreigner?
I think Brexit will mean that Britain will embrace the world in a way that perhaps it hasn't done for several decades, and probably begin to embrace, perhaps, I hope, the Commonwealth in a way that it hasn't done for decades. So no, absolutely. I think we are leaving behind a club that is not only anti-democratic, not only protectionist, but that actually has really cut us off from so many potentially amazing relationships all across the world. Brexit is not regressive. Brexit is not protectionist. Brexit is an act of national self-confidence that leaves us fit to engage more broadly with the globe. And I'm very excited about it.
All right, I'm going to come back to some of what you just said, but just moving on to the present. And I am going to keep checking my watch, not because I'm worried about missing neighbours, but because I know you're on a deadline. How would you rate the performance of the government in the Brexit negotiations today? You can do it 0 to 10 if it's easier.
Oh, it's not much above 0. I mean, it's dreadful. I mean, it took them 9 months to trigger Article 50. Mind you, that's partly because I know the Evening Standard are live streaming this. Good afternoon, George. Osborne almost boasting the other week that they didn't tell the civil service to prepare for Plan B, which, if you think about it, I mean, blooming good job. Cameron resigned and Osborne went. The very least thing they should have done was to make sure there was a contingency plan if Brexit was voted for, rather than some sort of awful threat of an emergency budget. So it took 9 months to trigger Article 50, and we then entered the transition period. Article 50 was the transition period. That's what it was designed to be, but that's not good enough. We're now signing up for another 21 months. We've made huge concessions, be it on money, being on fishing rights. Look, I'm not at all happy with the way the government's dealt with this, but I get back to my point that I made earlier. You know, even though I'm really angry about some of this stuff, I do see that 11 o'clock on the 29th of March next year is the big day. And once we've broken from those European Union treaties, we can then start to have a more intense political debate in this country about the issues. And I think, and I do think that's what will happen.
All right, but hang on, I want to try and do this systematically. In the absence of a plan to leave, because as you said, there wasn't one, didn't it make sense not to trigger Article 50 straight away?
Yes, I mean, it may well have taken 6 or 8 or 9 or 10 weeks to get prepared for it, not 9 months.
But doesn't the fact that it's taking so long, in a sense, prove your point? This, was a massively... The European Union had invade itself into the nooks and crannies of British life, and actually removing it is going to take time.
Well, look, I mean, if this was a private company that was undergoing a massive transformative change, it would not take 5 years to do it. The fact is that this is a massive transformative change that is being led by a civil service who appear to be deeply reluctant to actually carry out the wishes of the government and the electorate. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Senior civil servant leaves a department where they've been working with David Davis or working with Liam Fox and slags off Brexit. So, maybe that's part of the problem that we've got.
All right. Just on transition specifically, I mean, it seems to me that virtually any business you talk to says we need time to adapt. This isn't about the government negotiating with the European Union. This is about a lot of rules and regulations that might need to change. You need to change your business practices. You might need to change who you're trading with. It will take time. Why are you so opposed to that if it makes the process smoother?
I think perhaps you're missing something, which is that 80% of the British economy does not trade with any overseas company or any overseas country at all. 80% of the British economy is what takes place within these islands, and all of it is bound to European regulation and European law. And the point I'm making is the firms that are arguing they need the most time to transition tend to be the big firms who've actually got the biggest legal departments and compliance departments in place anyway. And we need to say to them, this change is happening, adapt to it. And then to say to the 80% of the British economy that's been bound in some cases by rules that aren't appropriate, we are about to give the small man and the small woman of this country a big break.
All right, I really do not want to refight the referendum, but I just have to say supply chains. That 80% misses out the number of British firms that trade with firms.
Look, I do understand there are areas like the car industry, where goods go back and forth. And surely the logical, rational thing economically for Monsieur Barnier and his mates is for there to be a tariff-free trade deal. And that would make life very easy going on and open us up to the rest of the world. But, we can't pay too big a price simply for that.
Do you think the referendum provided a mandate for a hard Brexit, as in leaving the single market?
Oh, there was no hard Brexit and no soft Brexit discussed in the referendum. Those terms hadn't even been invented. They were invented, again, by the political establishment and much of the mainstream media. Soft Brexit, nice, cuddly, good. Hard Brexit, bad, horrible, nasty. I mean, that's the narrative that's been created here. Look, let's be clear about one thing. We voted to leave the European Union, full stop. Full stop. That is what the referendum was about. However, in the case of the single market, every single leading player on both the Remain side and the Leave side said clearly, right through that campaign, that voting to leave meant leaving the single market. I don't think, from the perspective of the electorate, it could have been clearer.
But you can't move on social media without seeing a video of some leaver or other during the referendum campaign saying, it's OK, we'll be like Norway, don't worry, we've got to trade the same way as we can now. So I'm not sure that's true, is it?
Well, we'll be like Norway in terms of fishing, I hope. It's going to take a long time, but I pray we are, and we'll be a lot better off for it, and tens of thousands of jobs better off for it.
But look, that's not what they meant.
I said, every single major player on the Leave side and the Remain side, when asked in interviews, was explicit about the single market, and I repeat that.
But, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate about who's a major player and who's not, but off the top of my head, I can remember people like Dan Hannan talking about...
Well, as I said, every major player.
All right, OK.
No, but come on, if you polled, if you showed Dan's picture to 1,000 people in Hartlepool, how many would recognise him? 5, 10? I doubt even that. That's the point I'm making.
But the majority of Leave voters weren't in places like Hartlepool. They were Tory voters.
Well, actually, I think you'll find some of the biggest Leave majorities were, in fact, in northern Labour towns.
Both those things can be true.
And both those things can be true, absolutely.
So those Tory Leavers, who might have listened to people like Dan Hannan, who was saying we could stay in the single market...
Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Chris Grayling, these were the big Tory hitters in the referendum, and they all had a very, very clear message on this, as indeed did David Cameron, as indeed did Nick Clegg, as indeed did everybody who was part of the Remain campaign.
Do you accept the fact that there will be an economic cost to this country to leaving the single market in the customs union?
No.
Why not?
Do you know, I've heard all this before. I heard all this in 1990. You know, if we don't join the exchange rate mechanism, if we don't peg sterling against the Deutschmark, it'll be a catastrophe for the British economy. What we did, and my goodness me, it was probably the worst self-inflicted wound since joining the gold standard way back in 1929. I then heard in 2000, and that's when I still had a proper job, I still was in the commodities business, and I went to Mansion House to hear the Lord Mayor of the City of London and Goldman Sachs and Nissan and all the Peter Mandelson, all these frightfully important people, telling us that if we didn't join the euro, we'd be left behind. Businesses would leave Britain, the city would close down. For all the same arguments we're hearing today from all the same people. They have a history of being wrong about all of this, and they're wrong about this issue too, provided, and there is a caveat here, provided we have a government that's got the vision, the understanding of commercial life to take advantage from the things from Brexit that can benefit this country. So if we leave the European Union, and we maintain regulatory alignment in all areas, we don't have the courage to take back some of our fishing waters, whatever else it may be, we don't have the nous to crack on and sign trade deals quickly. If all those things stay in place, then after Brexit we would be, for the first few years, slightly worse off. But if we have a government that actually puts in place things that would give us an advantage, we could be better off and very quickly.
Just on the analogy, I mean, you're familiar with the story of the boy who cried wolf. I mean, eventually there was a wolf, all right? And it just strikes me that with whatever people said about the exchange rate mechanism, whatever people said about the euro, this is a different order of argument.
Oh, joining the euro was a pretty major thing.
No,
joining the euro was the biggest economic decision of modern times, and thank God we didn't listen to our political class.
But my point is, it's not necessarily a good analogy for what is happening now.
Look, we're leaving the Eurozone in terms of being linked to it inside a single market. We're leaving 15% of the world's GDP. There's a great big exciting world out there that's moving forwards. And politically, can I just say this? You know, Chuka said the other day that he thinks the Brexit vote means we're stealing our children's futures from them. Well, I really hope we are. Because if our children's futures is Catalonia, where people for simply having a different opinion are about to be locked up for 30 years, if stealing our children's future is taking them away from a union that now harries and bullies, whether it's Poland, whether it's Hungary, we're looking at a European Union that is becoming more centralised, more autocratic, more ambitious in terms of foreign policy, expansion and militarisation, and actually democratically a European Union that is beginning to disintegrate. And I think we will say to ourselves in years to come, we were the first out, we did ourselves a favour, and perhaps the rest of Europe too.
Do you not agree that countries trade most with countries nearest to them?
Traditionally, yes. Traditionally, yes. But boy, hasn't the world changed. So much more of our business now is done at the push of a button. The world has come to be a very much smaller place in all sorts of different ways. And look, and I work for European companies. I've shipped goodness knows how many tons of copper and aluminium in and out of Rotterdam. You know, I mean, I've done lots of business. I had an agency business in Milano. I've done lots of European business in my life. And of course we want to go on doing business with Europe, being friendly with Europe. But you don't need to be in a political union to have close economic and trading ties.
Okay, but that's slightly disingenuous. Leave political union to one side. You probably need to be in a single market and a customs union to trade to the same extent that we do now.
I don't think you do. And I think actually what the single market has done is to make the costs, particularly of manufacturing, way too expensive inside the whole of Europe, and to effectively cut ourselves off from opportunities in the rest of the world. You know, there's always a balance to be struck here, but actually the rest of the world is moving on. We have not taken advantage of that in this country in any way at all, and now's the moment.
Okay, bearing in mind what you just said, think of Germany, okay? Germany seems to manufacture quite a lot, seems to do it quite well. Germany seems to trade an awful lot with the rest of the world. They're in the European Union.
Yeah, our focus, I mean, I think almost our whole focus in this country has been wrong. From the top down, we've been obsessed with Europe, as if it's the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything, and it isn't. And I hope that what Brexit brings is not just a renewed national self-confidence and belief in who we are, but I hope actually too, commercially, we start to look at things very, very differently.
All right, I'm sorry to bore on about this. It's the last go at this. We make cars, okay?
Yeah.
We make German cars.
Yeah.
We make German cars based on just-in-time supply chains, meaning no customs checks, meaning the same rules and regulations. We can't do that with New Zealand because it's a long way away, right? So there are things you can do with your neighbours that you can't do with the Commonwealth or the rest of the world, and we do it particularly.
I don't know. I think the Japanese have shipped a few cars here over the years, haven't they? And paid, and because of the European Union, every consumer that buys a Japanese car pays a 10% tariff. So the Japanese have proved that being a long way away and having to pay the top tariff on cars, they can still sell motor cars in this country, which shows you that actually, for businesses, tariffs of 2 or 3% on most manufacturers, or up to 10 on motor cars, is one of many factors. You know, currency movements on a monthly basis would generally be more than tariffs are on most manufacturers. It's one of a number of factors facing a country. It is not the be-all and end-all. You know, I mean, look, come on. At the end of the day, we are going to have a trade deal on things like cars. It is going to happen. Why? Because whilst we do manufacture cars in this country, we basically sell cheap cars in Europe, and the Europeans had expensive cars here. And it's very much in their interest to do this deal. So there is going to be a deal on goods. I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. Financial services, more complicated, but it's more complicated now, to be honest with you. So, honestly, you can put up all these obstructions and all these barriers and all these difficulties. Ultimately, we'll deal with it.
I want to move on to the politics. Just one question about trade deals from the Commonwealth country I know best. If we try and sign a trade deal with India, the first thing they'll say is visas, please.
And we say no.
So where are these trade deals?
And we say no. I know the Indians are trying to use this as a lever. And look, but actually, wouldn't we prefer to have X number of skilled people coming here from India rather than Y number of unskilled people coming here from Southern and Eastern Europe? And isn't that the whole point? Isn't it amazing that our immigration policy, since the pressure came on the government, our immigration policy is to allow limitless numbers of unskilled and make it harder and harder for skilled people from New Zealand or India to come. So we're going to rethink and redo all of this. But as you well know, all over the world, generally, nearly always actually, free trade agreements are not accompanied by free movement of people.
Okay, well, we were going to arrive at immigration eventually, so let's do that now. I mean, firstly, do you regret at all the upset and uncertainty that has been caused to EU citizens here and UK citizens in the EU by this Brexit process?
No, because there isn't any, is there? It's ridiculous. I mean, I do wish the Prime Minister had been clearer. She should have said on day one, anybody that came to Britain, as we said in the campaign, anybody that has come to Britain legally is not going to have those rights challenged. Because, you know, we're not a banana republic, we're a civilized country. And although far too many people did come, they all came legally. And I think she perhaps ever so slightly gave the impression that was a bargaining chip in the early months. And I think that was a mistake.
But haven't we come perilously close to looking like a banana republic in the way that the administrative system of the Home Office has treated some of these people precisely who did come here legally?
Well, I have slagged off the civil service once in this interview. I don't need to repeat it, do I?
Right, what sort of immigration policy should we have?
Well, you know, we talk about Australia as being one. But just think about this, folks. You know, from Windrush, right up until your star speaker this morning became Prime Minister, so namely through the whole of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s until the end, we ran net migration into Britain running through those decades at about 30,000 net per year. One of my first observations on being elected to the European Parliament and meeting people of all nationalities across Europe, far more than I'd ever done in business, was I had no doubt that we had been the most successful country in Europe at immigration. We had the least racism, we had the best level of integration, and I saw great enmities and almost verging on hatreds in many other European countries. I felt we were a cut above the rest, and I regret to say that Mr. Blair turned a net 30,000 a year into a net 300,000 a year, and it's kind of upset the system. So we need to get a grip. We need to push very hard for integration. I'm not opposed to a sensible level of immigration coming into Britain every year. Not opposed at all. I never have been.
Our economy at the moment's got a record number of job vacancies at all skill levels, around 800,000 at the moment. How would you deal with that while cutting immigration? We need these people, don't we? Because we've got...
what we need to do is, you know, we've become the low-wage, low-productivity centre of Europe. Isn't it interesting? All these waves of immigration and our productivity levels are worse than France. I mean, God knows how that works. But so it hasn't really been all a great success. It's wonderful if you're a big employer and you want cheap labour. It's great if you're rich, you know, and it's cheaper nannies and, oh, the new nanny's from Slovakia, darling, and she's wonderful. I mean, all of that's great. For the rich and for the big businesses, it's great. What it's not been great for are the cohesion of communities. What it's not been great for are the ability of people to get their kids into primary school. What it's not been great for is the crisis that we face in our National Health Service, chiefly because our population is rising by 500,000 people every single year. So you know, we can't measure all of these things simply in terms of GDP and whether the major employers like it or not.
Is it chiefly because our population is rising, or is it because successive governments have failed to invest the money that the
How can you
migrants have
invest
earned
if
us?
you don't know how many people are coming in? When you have a managed migration policy, you can plan for the future. We haven't had a managed migration policy. Look, I mean, in 2010, you know, Call Me Dave becomes Prime Minister, and we're told that net migration's coming down to tens of thousands. It didn't. So perhaps they planned for tens of thousands, but we had hundreds of thousands.
But that's a failure of government planning, not of EU membership.
Governments can't plan if you have an open border.
All right, I want to move on to the politics because I'm conscious we're running out of time quite quickly here. Do you remember during the referendum campaign when you were asked if this vote ends up being 52-48 for Remain, what you...
I did. I said there'll be some inside the Conservative Party who'll be irreconciled to it and will battle and fight for a second
It
referendum.
would be a recipe for a second referendum.
I said it'll take at least 25 years.
Do you think there is a likelihood we end up having a second referendum before we leave?
I've been very worried about it. I have been very worried about it. Pretty clear to me the very high level of collusion that's been going on, not with Russia, by the way, but with Monsieur Barnier. A never-ending stream of Remainers going across to Brussels, you know, your Adonises and Cleggers and all that lot. And, of course, Keir Starmer, a regular on Eurostar. And I know, I see him. There clearly is a big establishment attempt to try to get the government to be beaten in the House of Commons and to precipitate a second referendum. And this is very much what Blair said this morning, out in the open, and it's a good thing that it is out there, clear, in the open. And I did fear a few months ago that the Remain side had a bit of momentum behind them. They were certainly working very hard in terms of their press management and everything, very professional, you know, leading the arguments week after week through the national media. And I was very worried there could be a second referendum. Do you know, today, with a year to go, I've been out and about, doing a few interviews, meeting people from the Remain side. Their calls now for a second referendum are beginning to look a bit ridiculous.
Why in the world did you call for a second referendum?
I didn't. Of course I didn't. I said I fear they will force a second referendum upon us, and the Leave side need to wake up to that reality. But I think today calls, 65. Well, I was on television and I said we may have to have a second referendum because the political class don't accept the first result. All right, sir. Sorry.
All right, keep going.
Honestly, dear oh dear. The last thing in the world we want or needs a second referendum, but now the calls for it are looking stupid because actually there's a very settled. The country is now coming together behind Brexit, very much so.
What's your evidence for that?
Very much so. A very steady 65 to 70% now do not want a second referendum and want the government to carry out the will of the first. But, and so actually, the Remainer minority is getting smaller with every month that passes. And as I say, today, they're beginning to look a little bit ridiculous.
Aren't you mixing up two things here? I mean, OK, there might not be a stable majority in favour of a second referendum, but there has been for the last 3 or 4 months a pretty stable majority saying voting to leave the European Union was the wrong decision.
Well, they may say that, but they haven't. But it doesn't mean, when they're asked the next question, what should the government do? And 70% of them say the government should carry out the will of the people. There is now a gaining acceptance. We voted for this. There is a growing acceptance. It's going to happen. And I think the most significant thing that's happened in UK politics in the last few weeks was Jeremy Corbyn, sacking Owen Smith when he called again for a second referendum. And Keir Starmer then coming into line very much on that and saying, look, we are leaving on March the 29th next year. And I think the Labour Party know that if they try to extend Article 50, if they try to push for a second referendum, it would do them irreparable damage in many of the Midlands and northern marginal seats that they need to win the next election.
Just imagine we had this referendum, by whatever means, the Parliament voted for it, and imagine we voted to remain in. What do you think would happen then?
Ask for another one, obviously. Keep going. No, look, do you know what? I've been very worried about this for months. Mm-hmm. Very worried there would be a second referendum. Very concerned we might have to confront this and fight it and not be in denial over it. But I think that's all changed in the last month or two. There isn't going to be a second referendum. We are going to leave next year. The terms upon which we leave make me, at the moment, extremely unhappy. There are huge political battles to fight for the years to come, but I do now believe we are leaving. And that, I think, is very much what the European Commission now accept too. And I think the Labour Party have woken up to it as well. OK,
but play my game. Imagine we have this referendum. We vote to remain. Where does that put the country politically? What happens next?
It'll be total chaos, I would think. Although, I have to say, I think that if you ask the British people to vote again, they'd be so angry that we get a much more bloody-minded leave than we got first time round.
But, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I mean, you have been regularly saying you're upset with the way the process is going. I don't get the sense that your people's army is angry at how Brexit is going now. Do you think that they can be remobilised?
Oh, gosh. I think there's considerable frustration in the country at the way it's going. I think Mr Corbyn knows that. I think Mr Corbyn knows that as much as anybody. Well, the People's Army is not at the moment particularly mobilised. I suppose that's perhaps the honest truth of it. And, maybe if I'd stayed on doing that delightful job of running UKIP, maybe it would be more mobilised than it is today. But let's put it like this. If Article 50 was delayed, if there was a threat of a second referendum, I think you'd see a kind of backlash of public anger, unlike anything you've ever seen before in this country.
I mean, talking of UKIP, I mean, I know that UKIP still exists.
Yeah.
Kind of. Do you get the sense that there's a UKIP-shaped hole in British politics now?
I think one of the problems is that there are many millions of people who voted for Brexit because they believed in this, they believed in this, they believed in this, and there's almost nobody on the public stage speaking for them at this moment in time. Remainers have got loads of people speaking for them. So, yeah, there is a big, big gap there. There's a very big gap there. Now, if I'm right, and we do leave next year, whilst there will be big sectoral battles to fight in the years to come, the act of leaving will, in a sense, calm that down. But if we do get a delay to Article 50 or whatever, then I think you will see UKIP or something like UKIP I think, grow very quickly.
Okay, just finally, because I know you've got to be off at 5 past, so we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Again, looking to the future and sort of speculating, is there any sort of outcome of this Brexit process that would make you think you'd been wrong?
Would it ever be wrong to get back your ability to be a democratic, self-governing, independent nation like 200 other countries in the world? No.
Would it not be wrong if you found that in places like the West Midlands, those leave voting people who thought they were leaving for a better economic future found themselves out of work?
No, we're not for sale. We're not for sale. We're not here to be bribed. Our liberty, our ability to be the masters of our own house matters more than some spurious economic prediction for the future. We are going to be a free country once again, folks. We're going to get real politics back in this country. We're going to fight general elections where the outcome actually matters, rather than having many of the big economic decisions decided, or social decisions, or whatever they may be, decided somewhere else. And that, I think, for the long-term future of politics, and journalism too, in many, many ways, and for academia, is going to be a very much better, very much healthier place to be. And as I say, as I repeat, we're getting out of the European Union at the right time. It is now showing genuine signs of disintegration.
And so just to be clear, and again hypothetically, even if that means economic pain?
All I can tell you from my perspective, my freedom, my liberty is not for sale, however much you want to bid me. It's not for sale. This is about more than GDP figures. It's about more than money. It's about more than very false economic debates that go on, because who knows whether your questions are right or my answers are right. No one ever knows the future of these things. And every single economic prediction the Treasury give us has been wrong for centuries.
But if I were right, you still wouldn't say you were wrong.
As I say, freedom is freedom. I would much rather be a free man living in a free country than to be bought off or bribed by anybody, including you.
That sounds like a decent soundbite on which to end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will make America great again.